Yes, long story short, yes, you should read The Black Company. And I know, I literally just put out a video talking about how we all need to read more more Noblebright fantasy. Yes, I know I just made that video, and now I'm suggesting that we all read The Black Company, which may be the grimmest, darkest fantasy I've ever read. But I swear there's a reason behind why I think we should all read The Black Company. In this video, I'm going to be going over, I'm going to be doing a spoiler-free review of The Black Company, and then I'm going to follow it with a discussion of its place in fantasy history, and then also why I think, as somebody who believes all of us fantasy monsters need to stop being the heathens we are and read more Noblebright fantasy, should be reading the most grimmest, darkest fantasy I've ever read. But first, let's jump into the spoiler-free review of this book with my summary of the story. So, The Black Company is a group of elite mercenaries in a dark and dangerous and evil world. When our story opens, they are in the middle of a contract to kill a near-immortal demonic beast that is wreaking havoc among the local village. But they might have bitten off more than they can chew. In the middle of this deadly hunt, when their group has already suffered at the hands of this monster, and they're at their wits' end of how to destroy the beast, they are offered a way out in the form of a new contract to an even more powerful and dangerous being. They accept this contract and begin the new campaign in the service of an even greater evil. This story is a first-person accounting of the events that take place while this company is in the service of this evil being. And with that general summary out of the way, I'm going to jump into the full review, and I'm going to ask that if you're enjoying this video so far to please like and subscribe, because this is a smaller channel that's still growing, and I'm reviewing kind of older, more obscure books that aren't going to get a lot of attention from the algorithm. So any interaction with this video helps the channel grow. So like, subscribe, or comment in the comments down below. Onto the review. Even though I think that we should all read this book, I do acknowledge that not everybody probably should read this book. There are dark events in this book and truly horrible people that lack many of the redeeming qualities that we find in a lot of the morally gray characters in similar grimdark fantasy books that we all come to know and love, like the First Law series or A Song of Ice and Fire. This is an account of hard and lost people that in a horrible situation in a horrible world. I don't know if it ever gets quite as graphic as, let's say, scenes from Dreams of the Dying, where the author is just explicitly describing these horrible evil acts that take place. Instead, what Glen Cook does in The Black Company is he describes these events in a way that makes you come up with these horrible events with your own mind, which honestly might be even worse. Like this way, he makes you, he gives you a background of what's going on, and then he makes you think of the horrors yourself. But I think this might be a really good transition point to start talking about the writing and prose of Glen Cook, because his style of writing is so different from anything else I had read in the past. While also being leaps and bounds better than the majority of what I've been reading throughout most of my booktube journey. The book is written from the perspective of our main character, Croker, who is the doctor / historian of The Black Company. And the main character's prose, how he is writing this history, is evidence that he is not an academic, he is not a scholar. Instead, he's a mercenary who sadly, in another better life, probably could have become a scholar or an academic because he has many of the characteristics needed to become one. He's inquisitive, he speaks in multiple languages, he understands multiple languages, but his writing leaves you no doubt that he is not a scholar, he is a mercenary. And at times, the writing seems very similar to a journal a soldier might keep for himself, rather than a professional account of this mercenary group. It does not always read as a historical document, as a historical record. His descriptions are simple, to the point, and give you a general image of the horrors that are going on, while leaving it up for you to kind of create the full picture for yourselves. And at first, this is super jarring. And yes, I know that every single fantasy book is kind of has that jarring moment at the beginning where you're getting settled in the world, where you're getting settled with the writing style of the author. But this beginning is so jarring. The Glen Cook's writing style is so jarring that it made me wonder if this book had ever seen an editor. It made me think that, like, it made me wonder, like, I have a note written down that makes me say, like, hey, should Glen Cook have ever picked up a pen? Those were my thoughts starting this book out. Like, I almost didn't finish it because his writing style, his prose is so different from what I'm used to. It was jarring. I don't know how else to describe it. But like most other fantasy books, once I was immersed in the world and familiar with how he was writing and describing this world, I came to appreciate how he was writing in the first place and how the writing itself contributes to the grim darkness of the world. It is part of the world building itself. It is part of the character creation. Like, it makes Croker a more fully fleshed out character because of the prose and writing skill of Glen Cook, because of the way the book is written. And since I'm talking about how his writing style and prose contributes to character, I think this is a good time to bring up the fact that I think, as far as characterization goes, Glen Cook's Black Company is up there with the greatest of the greats. Like, when I think of people who write great characters, I think George R.R. Martin, I think Joe Abercrombie, I think Robin Hobb, and I think Glen Cook stands toe-to-toe with every single one of them with his Black Company. And I'll give you just one example of what I mean by this. Early on in the story, the names of the characters in the demonish buildings, they infuriated me. Like, they made me so upset. It was one of the reasons why I almost put this book down. For example, the guy with one eye is named One Eye. The guy who limps is named Limper. And the big bad boss who dominates the entire world is called a Dominator. Like, it just sounded so ridiculous at first. It just goes back to how I thought this dude probably should have never picked up a pen. I wondered if this book had been edited before it was put on the shelves to be published. It really threw me for a loop when I got started. But the more you're in the story, you see how quickly and deeply this kind of naming develops the characters into who they are, and honestly kind of mimics real life. It's kind of dumb, but it's like if you're growing up and you have a buddy that limps all the time, so you and his close friends start calling him the Limper. It's dumb, but it happens, especially in really close groups of people who are experiencing or overcoming like hardships together. It's almost like they're saying to each other, like, hey, you're my friend, I see that you limp, and I accept that. Hey, Limper. It's like saying, like, you're one of us, I see what's happening, but we don't care. And I'm not saying that's always what's happening with Glen Cook's naming, the way he names in the book, but it does reflect real life to a certain sense. And what's so funny with this naming algorithm is that even though these names really bothered me at first, in the end, they made the characters so much more real to me, so much more fleshed out, and made them stand out uniquely in my mind. And you never lose track of who these characters are. I had actually just read The Silmarillion shortly before reading this Black Company book, and I lost track of all the names. I could not remember who was who, and I found myself kept on rereading, trying to go back and figure things out, and it was hard. No fear of that happening here. Like, you will never forget who Limper is. You will never forget who One Eye is, because they are so ingrained in your head because of the naming system. And maybe that's a bad example. Maybe that example turns you off and is like, why does that make the characterization so great? But there's like 1,000 other small ways that I could talk about, but then the review would just be longer than the book. I still want to get to the history I still want to get to the Black Company's place in the history of fantasy. So I am going to keep moving by talking about the plot, and specifically a unique point about the plot. You see this in other books, but I think Glen Cook did it in a really unique and cool way that makes it stand out and really shine in this book. And that is that even though we are following a main plot with our main characters, like we are following a main storyline with Croker, as him and his black companies have to navigate serving under these powerful beings. While we're following their story, we see these like super powerful evil beings lurking in the background, beings that we don't understand, and with power that even the wizards of the group tremble at when they think they might have to go against them. So it is with this main plot that we start to realize that our main plot is really just a side. Like it is, these main characters are just pawns on the chessboard for these super powerful, evil, demonic beings. Like they are the main characters. They have the main plot going on. And this is just a small story in their big game. And I think this was powerful because it's layers to the story. It's a plot within a plot, but it's also very like thematic for Glen Cook, because I think he's also trying to write about war in general, like in real life, about how a few powerful people can determine how have huge effects on the lives of their soldiers. So for me, even though I came out with a video talking about how I'd been rating books wrong and how I've been rating books too high, the only other video I've done since making that was a 5-star read of The Wizard Knight. I do think this is either a high 4 or a low 5 for me. Like this was a really, really great book that really stood out. Not only is it like in one of my favorites category, but the technical skills in this book, the storyline, I think makes it subjectively good. Like taking whether or not you like the story out of it, whether you like the grim darkness, I think it's technically a really strong book. So this puts it right on that border of high 4s, low 5s, and I think it's something that time is really needed to tell whether or not it crosses into that 5-star category. Who do I think needs to read this book? One, obviously, lovers of grimdark fantasy. Like they want to see where their favorites most likely got their inspiration from. This is the book for them. Two, I think it's people who are interested in like wartime fantasy. Gene Wolfe says that most of war is just sitting around and waiting for the fighting to get started. And there's a lot of sitting around and waiting for the fighting to get started in this book. So I think people who are interested in that aspect would be interested in this book. And then the third type of person, I think, are people like me who think they need more Noblebright fantasy. And I know that sounds contradictory, but I'll explain after I get into the discussion of the Black Company's place in history. So I'm going to start talking about that, and I think it starts with grimdark fantasy in general. So I wanted to kind of talk about the difference between grimdark fantasy and just a fantasy with morally gray heroes or anti-heroes in it, because they are not the same thing. Morally gray characters or anti-heroes can take place in any subgenre of fantasy. So you can have morally gray characters and anti-heroes in Noblebright fantasy. And I'm kind of going to use Kelsier from Mistborn as an example of this. Mistborn is set in like this dark dystopian fantasy world, but it is not grimdark fantasy whatsoever. I would actually classify Mistborn as a noble dark fantasy, where the world is dark, but we have real heroes, true heroes, who are willing to step up and try to put themselves in harm's way while trying to change the world for the better. But Kelsier is not one of these heroes. Yes, people consider him a hero, but his goals is not to save the world. He has his own selfish reasons for doing what he does, and he's willing to commit horrible atrocities in order to do it. He's willing to harm anybody who stands in his way. And I'm kind of just bringing this up as an example of not every book with morally gray characters or anti-heroes is a grim, dark fantasy. We see these characters in other types of stories. Any story can have these stories in it. Grim, dark fantasy is different. Grimdark fantasy is set in an almost dystopian world that has real world aspects to it. Often, these worlds focus on or exaggerate the very evil side of our reality. Things like the fact that our world is not fair. It has social and political classes that present unfair advantages to people. People do not start off on a level playing field. And then even if they are on a level playing field, horrors can happen to you that are outside of your control. Life is not fair. And yes, in these grimdark fantasies, their characters are morally gray. Their heroes do have flaws. And villains do have redeeming quality. So why am I discussing all this? Why am I discussing the differences between grimdark fantasy and Noblebright fantasy and Nobledark and Grimbright? And why am I doing this? It's because when we look into the historical significance of the Black Company, we see the conversation mainly being around its relationship and contributions to grimdark fantasy, with many arguing that this is the first grimdark fantasy and Glen Cook being the father of the subgenre. And as of right now, I am leaning towards agreeing with this sentiment. I agree with this conclusion. The Black Company, I think, was published in the mid-1980s, standing in a time period that I personally label as the Great Transition, where grimdark was not the norm. The norm was to publish like this Tolkien-esque fantasy. And the reason I call this period of time the Great Transition is because of books like The Black Company, books that have been described as anti-Tolkien being published and loved by the fantasy audience. Books like The Black Company helped inspire people to start taking risks. The two biggest examples that come to mind are Malazan and The First Law, both of which are considered by many to be some of the greatest fantasy series of all time, and directly credit The Black Company for serving as inspiration for their own stories. Stephen Erickson even writes in the introduction of the reprint of The Black Company when it was made into a Tor Essential. His exact words were, "Glen Cook single-handedly changed the face of fantasy." And this is interesting because there's much discussion about what the first grimdark fantasy was, and many disagree that it was the Black Company. A lot of people argue that Thomas Covenant is grimdark fantasy, and that was published long before Glen Cook ever published The Black Company. And while I agree that it definitely paved the path for The Black Company, like by subverting classic fantasy tropes of what a fantasy protagonist is supposed to look like, and preparing both people, readers, and most importantly, publishers to gamble on books like The Black Company that aren't Tolkien-esque, that don't fit into the Tolkien mode. Even though people argue Thomas Covenant is, I do not believe that, and I'm doing a full review on Thomas Covenant. I'll talk about that more. I'll talk about this a little bit more during. But the two closest examples that I think people could argue are grimdark are actually Elric of Melniboné and then Conan. And what's interesting about these is that they could be argued to be grimdark fantasy, even if they are not taken to their extreme. But I think it can also be argued that they are noble dark fantasy or grim bright fantasy, with morally gray anti-heroes or morally gray characters. But the Black Company did what none of these other books before it did. And what they did made it why Tor considers it one of its essentials, and why it has such a big impact on the fantasy community. It took grimdark fantasy to its extreme and is the defining book of the subgenre. It is grimdark fantasy in its purest form and is the gold standard for other grimdark fantasies to be compared to. Whereas arguments can be made that Conan and Elric or Thomas Covenant are grimdark fantasy, nobody can argue that Glen Cook's Black Company is not grimdark fantasy. What's more is that this book did so much more than just popularize grimdark fantasy. Like Thomas Covenant, the Black Company showed authors, readers, and most importantly, like I said before, publishers, that there was a appetite for something other than these Tolkien-esque stories. and is the reason why we have such a broad open market that we do today. It's for all these reasons and more that I think that Tor made this one of their essentials, and why The Black Company is such a classic of fantasy in the first place. With all these other books, just like all the other books that I'm going to be including in my fantasy through history segment I'm trying to create on the channel, / like classics of fantasy segment, I encourage everyone who has something else to say on this subject to post it in the comments below. What did I miss? Is there more to this book's place in history? Let me know. But for now, I'm going to move on to the last portion of this, which is why I think that, as somebody who believes that we all need to stop being degenerates and start reading more Noblebright fantasy, why I think that we should still read The Black Company and books like Black Company. And the answer is simple. Many of you have probably guessed it. And it begins with the fact that I think it's important to see life with heroes. Heroes that portray the Noblebright standards. Normal, everyday people who make the world a better place through heroic acts. But Grimdark fantasy is important as well, and maybe of equal importance. People need to see what life is like without heroes too, without goodness. We need to see what happens when normal everyday people don't stand up and do heroic acts, when normal everyday people are bad. And this book, The Black Company, it does not have a hero. No one swoops in to save the day, and they don't even have a normal everyday person who is fighting for something other than themselves. It is a world totally and completely devoid of hope. And while one can argue that there's a little bit of hope at the end of the book, I would argue otherwise. I don't think it's hope. I think it's the possibility of a future hope, which is why they wait until the book's completely done, completely resolved, the resolution's all not wrapped up and nice and pretty, before they put that little teaser out there. If you jump from The Black Company to a book like Lord of the Rings or Wizard Knight, or even Brandon Sanderson's Stormlight Archives, you will get the stark contrast of what worlds look like with heroes with them and without heroes with them. And maybe it will inspire more of us to become heroes of our own world. So I think that is why, even though I think we should all read more Noblebright fantasy, why I think you should also read Glen Cook's The Black Company. And with that, this review comes to the end. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed this. This channel is small, and I'm hoping it will grow, and I'm kind of covering lesser talked about books right now. So any interaction with the channel helps. So please like and subscribe. And until next time, read more books. Thanks for watching.